Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're focusing on Eritrea, specifically the country under President Isaias Afwerki.
That's right.
And the sources you've shared, they paint a really intricate picture. It's quite troubling in many ways, especially considering the nation's history started with so much promise, didn't it?
It really did. I mean, back in 1993, when independence was finally achieved after such a long struggle, there was a huge amount of global optimism.
Right.
People were talking about Eritrea as a potential beacon of hope for the whole region. And Isaias Afwerki himself, well, some saw him as this Renaissance leader.
It's almost hard to reconcile that initial hope with the situation described now.
It is.
So to help us kind of get our heads around this, we're going to use two key metaphors that pop up: the stopped watch and East African North Korea.
Yeah.
The stopped watch idea, it suggests that, forward momentum, progress in really key areas just seems to have stalled out sometime after independence.
Yeah, like time just stopped moving forward in certain ways. And the second one, East African North Korea, well, it's a strong comparison, maybe provocative.
Definitely provocative.
But it points to some really concerning parallels. How the country's run, the human rights situation, how isolated it is internationally. It helps us try to grasp a system that has this very, very tight control over people's lives.
So our aim today basically is to dig into the main factors, the key events that have really shaped Eritrea's path under President Isaias. How did a country that started out with such high expectations end up in its current, let's say, very challenging situation?
Okay.
Right. Let's get into it. Maybe start with Isaias Afwerki himself. How did he consolidate so much power?
Well, his background in the liberation struggle is absolutely key. He was involved with the early Eritrean Liberation Front, the ELF, but then became a really central figure in the EPLF, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front.
And the EPLF, reading the sources, it sounds like it was a pretty unique organization, very disciplined.
Extremely. One source calls it a tough nationalist organization, controlled by a highly centralized inner party. There seems to have been this sort of ingrained authoritarian culture, this idea of democratic centralism right from the beginning.
So could you argue that was kind of a blueprint for how things would be run later?
I think that's a really good point. Right. I mean, the very things that made them effective in the war, that tight cohesion, the centralized control, they do seem to have laid the groundwork for the post-independence structure.
Okay.
And throughout the 80s, Isaias was maneuvering within the EPLF, building loyalty, consolidating his position. By 1987, he becomes Secretary General.
Giving him, as one source says, unquestioned control.
Pretty much, yeah. Unquestioned control within the EPLF.
Then, after independence in 91 and he becomes president in 93, the EPLF transforms. It becomes the PFDJ, the People's Front for Democracy and Justice, in 1994.
Right.
And critically, this becomes the only legal political party. Isaias, chairman, commander-in-chief. So basically, any room for other political voices just vanished.
That transition really solidified the power structure. But, maybe one of the most telling moments came a bit later, with the Constitution in 1997.
Ah, the Constitution. It was drafted, ratified.
Yeah, it looked like maybe a step towards a more democratic setup.
But it was never actually implemented, was it? That feels huge. Like, you draw up the plans, maybe even lay the cornerstone, and then just walk away. What does that tell us?
It really makes you question the commitment to democratic governance.
Yeah.
Right from the early days. And then you add the fact that there have been 0 national elections since the independence referendum back in 93.
0.
And Isaias himself, I think it was 2010, he actually said something about maybe delaying elections for, 3 or 4 decades, maybe more?
Wow. Delaying for decades. That's quite a statement about intent, isn't it?
It speaks volumes, yeah. And it fits with this consistent pattern we see in the sources of just shutting down any dissent.
Like the G15, the prominent opposition leaders arrested in 2001.
Exactly. They were pushing for reforms, pushing for the Constitution to be implemented. They get arrested, and to this day, their fate is unknown.
Unknown. That's chilling. It's like the stopped watch just completely froze any move towards political openness right there.
And it wasn't an isolated incident. We also have the case of Berhane Prehe, the former finance minister. He published a book calling for change.
And died in detention.
And around the same time, 2001, the independent press was completely dismantled. Critical journalists jailed.
It's a clear pattern emerging. Ignoring due process, handling political cases outside the law, arbitrary arrests, detention.
And impunity. People responsible for abuses seemingly face no consequences. It paints a picture of a state apparatus where challenging the government is incredibly dangerous.
And interestingly, the sources suggest external conflicts were used to perhaps justify this internal clampdown.
That's a key argument, yes. The border dispute with Ethiopia, which really flared up in 1998, became this constant reason given for the repressive conditions.
An excuse.
The excuse, exactly. And the reason for not implementing the Constitution, it's a classic move, isn't it? Use an external enemy to tighten control at home.
It really is. And then later, the dispute with Djibouti in 2008, that just added another layer. More isolation. Another reason for a state of emergency.
Precisely. So any flicker of potential opening up just seemed to get snuffed out by these external situations, or at least they were used as the reason.
Meanwhile, the government's pushing this rhetoric of self-reliance, national unity.
Which on the surface might sound positive, but it's also used to reject what they call Western-style democracy, and crucially, to silence internal critics.
And this ties into the national service becoming indefinite, what started as a duty.
Yeah, transformed into something else entirely. A tool for forced labor, according to many sources, and a way to exert massive social control.
It's worth noting, though, the peace deal with Ethiopia in 2018, that must have raised hopes.
Huge hopes. Reestablishing ties, ending the state of war. People thought, okay, maybe now things will loosen up internally.
But the sources say, not really.
Essentially, no. The fundamental internal situation, the repression, seems to have continued largely unchanged, even after that major external conflict was resolved.
Table 1 in one source really lays out this timeline clearly, doesn't it? Step by step, consolidating power, silencing opposition, using conflicts.
It does. It shows a very consistent path towards centralized, absolute control under Isaias.
Okay, so we see the power structure. Now let's shift to the human cost. The human rights situation described in the sources is, well, it's grim.
It is. The reports talk about persistent patterns of gross human rights violations. Things like forced disappearances, torture, really cruel treatment, horrific prison conditions.
Arbitrary detention seems widespread.
Widespread, yes.
Yeah.
And political prisoners often held incommunicado, sometimes, in underground cells. It's deeply discouraging stuff.
And mentioning Berhan Abreha again, the G15, those journalists, it makes it real, doesn't it? These aren't just statistics. They're people whose lives were shattered, families left in the dark for years.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It underscores just how severe the crackdown on any perceived dissent really is.
But maybe the most unique and damaging aspect is this policy of indefinite military or national service.
Yeah, that stands out. Legally, it's supposed to be 18 months.
Right.
But in practice, since the state of emergency declared in 98 during the war with Ethiopia, it's become indefinite for many, many Eritreans.
Indefinite meaning.
Yeah.
Years. Decades.
Years. Potentially decades. For what the sources call paltry pay.
Paltry pay.
And the descriptions are stark. It amounts to forced labor, potentially involving inhumane, degrading treatment and torture. It's a system that basically dictates the lives of a huge part of the population.
And the impact on education sounds devastating.
Oh, absolutely.
Yep.
Taking final year high school students, sometimes kids still under 18, and sending them to the Sawa military camp.
Saw, right.
It completely disrupts their schooling and essentially funnels them straight into this endless service. And think about the impact on teachers, on standards. It's huge.
So it's maybe not surprising then that this is seen as a primary reason for people leaving the country.
A massive driver, yes. The sources mention thousands fleeing every month. One estimate suggests something like 17% of the entire population had sought asylum abroad by 2024.
17%, that's staggering. It speaks volumes about the desperation.
It really does. And beyond the national service, other basic freedoms are severely limited.
Like what?
Well, civic space is described as completely closed. No real freedom of expression, assembly, association, no independent media, obviously, no real civil society groups, no political opposition allowed.
And religion, too.
Severe restrictions there as well. Arbitrary detention of people from non-recognized faiths, including children sometimes. Religious leaders imprisoned for long periods. It shows this intolerance for anything outside state control.
Add restrictions on just moving around freely, it all creates this sense of confinement, doesn't it? Pushing people to flee.
Exactly. And then there's this other layer, transnational repression. The regime trying to control Eritreans even after they've left the country.
How does it even work?
The sources detail some really concerning tactics. Alleged kidnappings, enforced disappearances, surveillance, threats, harassment against diaspora members and their families back home.
Violence even.
Violence, smear campaigns, social isolation, even denying basic consular services like passports unless people comply or pay certain fees.
Wow. One source describes Eritrean embassies almost like criminal enterprises, extorting the diaspora.
Yeah, under threat of harm coming to their relatives back in Eritrea.
Yeah.
It's a shocking claim, but it highlights the reach and the coercive methods apparently being used. Table 2 really summarizes these violations starkly.
Okay, let's turn to the economy. It feels like it must be deeply connected to the political and human rights situation.
Oh, completely intertwined. Eritrea's economy consistently ranks near the very bottom globally in terms of economic freedom, like 171st out of 184 in the 2025 index.
Why so low?
The assessments point to really fundamental problems. Poor governance, a lack of commitment to structural reform, bad management of public finances, underdeveloped legal frameworks. Basically, the building blocks for a functioning market economy just aren't there.
It's described as a command-based economy, right?
Right.
Government controlling pretty much everything.
Exactly. Production, prices, distribution, all tightly controlled. And over the last 20-something years, there's been this aggressive push to ban or take over almost all private businesses.
Bringing them under the control of the ruling party, the PFDJ, or the military.
Right. So if you're thinking about private investment, domestic or foreign, the lack of clear rules, the difficulty getting foreign currency, the sheer level of government control, it makes it incredibly difficult and risky.
It sounds almost like a deliberate suppression of private enterprise.
You could certainly interpret it that way. And then you had those currency controls introduced in 2016.
The draconian ones. New banknotes, strict withdrawal limits.
Yeah. Sources say it led to major economic stagnation, basically killed competitiveness, and created this weird coupon economy where cash was incredibly scarce. It must have paralyzed daily economic life for ordinary people.
And on top of all that, there's the debt.
A huge issue, an unsustainable debt burden. The debt-to-GDP ratio figures vary slightly, but they're incredibly high, like 176%, or even up to 211%.
So the country owes almost twice what it produces in a year.
Essentially, yes. Which means a massive chunk of the budget has to go just to servicing that debt, leaving less for anything else. And foreign direct investment. It's actually been negative, meaning more money is leaving than coming in. No confidence from outside investors.
And corruption, is that a factor?
Sources mention systemic corruption, bribery, extortion, nepotism within government institutions. That obviously erodes trust and just sucks vitality out of the economy.
So the overall picture is pretty bleak.
Yeah, the result is a significant decline in economic development and living standards, very limited job opportunities, widespread poverty. One figure mentioned 70% poverty back in the late 90s, and it's hard to see how it's improved dramatically.
Even spending on things like education is low.
Below regional averages.